In the humid swamps of Florida, where alligators lurk beneath murky waters and Spanish moss hangs like funeral shrouds from ancient oak trees, a different kind of predator once stalked the highways. Her name was Aileen Wuornos, and by the time her killing spree ended in 1990, she had shattered every preconceived notion about female criminals and serial killers in America. The story begins not with murder, but with abandonment. On February 29, 1956, in the industrial city of Rochester, Michigan, Aileen Carol Pittman entered a world that seemed determined to reject her from the very beginning. Born to Diane Wuornos and Leo Dale Pittman, her life was marked by tragedy before she could even walk. Her father, Leo, was a psychopathic child molester who would later hang himself in prison, leaving behind a genetic legacy that some would argue predetermined Aileen's fate. Diane, barely more than a child herself at 16, found herself overwhelmed by the responsibilities of motherhood. When Aileen was just 4 years old, her mother made a decision that would echo through the decades. She abandoned her daughter and son Keith, leaving them on the doorstep of their maternal grandparents, Lori and Britta Wuornos, in Troy, Michigan. The Wuornos household was no sanctuary for abandoned children. Lori Wuornos, whom Aileen would grow up believing was her father, was an alcoholic with a violent temper and an apparent hatred for his granddaughter. The abuse began early and took many forms. Physical beatings were routine, but the psychological torture proved even more damaging. Aileen would later describe her childhood as a living nightmare. She claimed that Lori would strip her naked and beat her with a leather belt for the slightest infractions. More disturbing still were her allegations of sexual abuse, not only by her grandfather but also by his friends. In the cold Michigan winters, she would sometimes be locked outside in the snow as punishment, forced to beg for entry back into the house. School offered no respite. Aileen was an outcast among her peers, mocked for her poor hygiene, her strange behavior, and her increasingly violent outbursts. Her face bore the marks of severe acne, and her teeth were crooked and stained. She learned early that her body was the only currency she possessed that others valued. By the age of 9, Aileen was already engaging in sexual activities with local boys in exchange for cigarettes, food, or simply acceptance. She would later claim that her first sexual encounter was with her own brother Keith, though these accounts varied in their details throughout her life. What remained consistent was the portrait of a child who had been robbed of innocence before she understood what innocence was. The beatings at home intensified. Britta Wuornos, her grandmother, was a passive figure who failed to protect the children from Lori's rage. The household operated under a regime of fear, where children were seen but not heard, and any sign of rebellion met with swift and brutal punishment. At 14, Aileen's life took another devastating turn when she became pregnant. The father was allegedly a friend of her grandfather's, a much older man who had raped her. Rather than receiving support or understanding, she was branded as promiscuous and troublesome. The pregnancy was kept secret from neighbors and school officials, but within the household, it became another source of shame and violence. When her grandmother Britta died of liver failure in July 1971, any semblance of stability in Aileen's life crumbled. Lori, now alone with his rage and alcoholism, became even more violent. The beatings increased in frequency and severity. Finally, unable to bear the abuse any longer, Lori threw 15-year-old Aileen out of the house. Homeless, pregnant, and with nowhere to turn, Aileen found herself living in the woods surrounding Troy, Michigan. She survived by shoplifting, petty theft, and prostitution. The baby, born in March 1971, was immediately given up for adoption. Aileen never saw her child again, but the experience left her with a deep-seated resentment toward men and a growing belief that she could only rely on herself for survival. Life on the streets hardened her quickly. She learned to fight, to steal, and to manipulate. She discovered that her sexuality, despite her physical appearance, could be a weapon of sorts. Men would pay for her services, and in those transactions, she found a twisted form of power and control that had been absent from her childhood. Her criminal record began accumulating: disorderly conduct, drunk and disorderly behavior, assault, and check forgery. Each arrest was followed by brief periods of incarceration, but prison offered no rehabilitation, only more hardship and the opportunity to network with other criminals. Throughout her 20s, Aileen drifted across the United States like a tumbleweed, never staying in one place long enough to establish roots. She worked as a prostitute in Colorado, moved through Kansas, and eventually made her way south to Florida, drawn by the warm climate and the anonymity that came with being just another face among the tourists and transients. In Florida, she began frequenting truck stops and highway rest areas along Interstate 75 and other major thoroughfares. These locations became her hunting grounds, not yet for murder, but for clients who would pay for her services. Truckers, traveling salesmen, and other men far from home were her primary customers. She learned their patterns, their vulnerabilities, and their desires. The relationships she formed during this period were typically brief and turbulent. She had a particular attraction to women, though she would also engage with men when it served her purposes. Her sexuality was fluid, shaped more by survival and opportunity than by genuine attraction or love. In 1976, she married Louis Gratz Fell, a wealthy retiree she had met in a Florida yacht club. The marriage seemed like an escape from her life of poverty and prostitution, but it lasted only 9 weeks. Fell, 70 years old, accused Aileen of beating him with his own walking stick and squandering his money. The marriage was annulled, but not before Aileen had gained experience in manipulating older, vulnerable men. In 1986, at a gay bar called Aunt Charlie's in Daytona Beach, Aileen met the person who would become the most important figure in her life, Tyria Jolene Moore, known as Ty. The relationship that developed between these two women was complex, passionate, and ultimately tragic. Ty was 24, 4 years younger than Aileen, and came from a more stable background. She had grown up in Ohio, had held legitimate jobs, and possessed a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to Aileen's hard edges. For Aileen, who had never experienced genuine love or acceptance, Ty represented everything she had ever wanted but never believed she could have. The two women moved in together almost immediately, renting cheap motel rooms and apartments throughout Central Florida. Aileen continued working as a prostitute to support them both, while Ty held various low-paying jobs when she could find them. Aileen was fiercely protective of their relationship and would often tell clients and acquaintances that she was earning money for her wife. For a brief period, it seemed as though Aileen might have found stability. Ty's presence in her life gave her something to live for beyond mere survival. She spoke of wanting to go straight, of finding legitimate work, of building a normal life with the woman she loved. But the skills needed for legitimate employment, the ability to maintain steady schedules, to interact appropriately with supervisors and co-workers, to manage stress without violence, had never been developed during her chaotic youth. Financial pressures mounted. Ty, despite her genuine affection for Aileen, enjoyed the lifestyle that Aileen's earnings provided. They could afford nice dinners, hotel rooms, and the freedom to travel. When Aileen suggested finding other work, the reality of their dramatically reduced income became apparent. November 30, 1989, would forever mark the boundary between Aileen Wuornos the prostitute and Aileen Wuornos the killer. On that night, along a remote stretch of highway in Volusia County, Florida, she encountered Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old electronics store owner from Clearwater. Mallory had picked up Aileen for sex, as had hundreds of men before him. They drove to a secluded area off Interstate 95, a routine that Aileen knew well. But something went wrong that night, exactly what remains a matter of debate and conflicting testimony. According to Aileen's later confessions, Mallory became violent during their encounter. She claimed he tied her up, raped her, and threatened to kill her. In fear for her life, she reached for the .22 caliber pistol she had begun carrying for protection and shot him multiple times. Mallory died instantly, his body left in the woods where it wouldn't be discovered for nearly 2 weeks. However, the physical evidence told a different story. Mallory had been shot 4 times, and the angles of the wounds suggested he had been standing when shot, not attacking her. His pants were still on, contradicting her claims of rape. Most damning of all, his wallet was missing, along with his car, which Aileen drove back to the motel she shared with Ty. Whether the killing was self-defense or premeditated murder, the psychological impact on Aileen was profound. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. For the first time in her life, she had held absolute power over another human being. The man who had paid to use her body was now dead by her hand, and she had his money, his car, and his possessions. When she returned to Ty that night, covered in blood and clearly traumatized, she told a story of self-defense. Ty, whether she believed the account or simply chose not to question it, helped her clean up and dispose of evidence. They used Mallory's car for several days before abandoning it, and they spent his money on food, lodging, and alcohol. The murder of Richard Mallory might have remained an isolated incident, but the psychological and practical precedent had been set. Aileen had discovered that killing clients was not only possible but profitable. The combination of sexual violence she claimed to have experienced and the financial rewards created a deadly cycle. Over the next 11 months, Aileen would kill 6 more men, each encounter following a similar pattern. She would be picked up by a client, usually along Interstate 75, or Interstate 95, the major highways that served as Florida's arteries of commerce and tourism. The men were typically middle-aged, traveling alone, and carrying cash. The second victim was David Spears, a 43-year-old construction worker from Sarasota. On May 19, 1990, his nude body was found in the woods near Interstate 75 in Citrus County. He had been shot 6 times with a .22 caliber weapon. His truck was missing and was later found abandoned in a remote area. Charles Carskadden, a 40-year-old part-time rodeo worker, became the 3rd victim on May 31, 1990. His body was discovered in Pasco County, shot 9 times. Like the others, his vehicle and wallet were missing. The brutality of the attack suggested increasing confidence and violence on Aileen's part. Troy Burress, a 50-year-old sausage salesman from Ocala, was killed on July 30, 1990. His body was found in a wooded area of Marion County, shot twice in the torso and back. His delivery truck was found days later, abandoned and stripped of valuables. The 5th victim, Dick Humphreys, was a 56-year-old retired Air Force major and former police chief who worked as a child abuse investigator. The irony of his profession was not lost on investigators later examining the case. Humphreys was shot 7 times, and his car was found abandoned after being involved in a minor traffic accident that drew police attention. Walter Gino Antonio, a 60-year-old security guard, became the 6th victim in November 1990. His nearly nude body was found shot 4 times. His car was recovered days later, abandoned in a different county. The final victim was Peter Seams, a 65-year-old missionary from Alabama. His body was never found, but his car was discovered after Aileen and Ty had been involved in a traffic accident while driving it. Witnesses to the accident provided descriptions of 2 women fleeing the scene, marking the beginning of the end for Aileen's killing spree. As the body count mounted, Florida law enforcement agencies began to recognize a pattern. The victims were all middle-aged men who had been shot multiple times with a .22 caliber weapon. Their vehicles were consistently stolen and later abandoned. Personal items, especially wallets and money, were missing. Most telling of all, the locations where the bodies were found clustered around the interstate highways where prostitutes were known to work. The formation of a multi-agency task force marked the first coordinated effort to catch what investigators now recognized as a serial killer. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement, local sheriff's offices, and the FBI began sharing information and resources. The case was unprecedented. Female serial killers were extraordinarily rare, and those who existed typically used different methods and targeted different victim types. Profilers struggled to understand the psychology behind the crimes. Traditional serial killer profiles focused on male perpetrators who were driven by sexual fantasy, power, or sadistic impulses. Aileen's crime seemed motivated by a combination of financial gain and pathological rage toward men. The personal nature of the attacks, multiple gunshot wounds, often at close range, suggested intense anger rather than the calculated detachment typical of many serial killers. The breakthrough came when investigators connected the traffic accident involving Peter Seam's car to witness descriptions of two women. Composite sketches were created and distributed to law enforcement agencies throughout the region. The women were described as appearing to be lovers, with one significantly more masculine in appearance than the other. By late 1990, the investigation had identified numerous witnesses who had seen two women matching the suspects' descriptions at various locations connected to the crimes. Truck stops, bars, and motels along the interstate corridors became focal points for the investigation. The media attention surrounding the case was intense. The concept of a female serial killer operating independently, not as part of a team or under male influence, challenged societal assumptions about women and violence. Headlines screamed about a female serial killer and highway hooker killer, terms that would follow Aileen for the rest of her life. On January 8, 1991, investigators got their break. Acting on tips from the public who had recognized the composite sketches, police located Aileen and Ty at a biker bar called The Last Resort in Port Orange, Florida. Aileen was arrested on an outstanding warrant for illegal possession of a firearm, while Ty was held for questioning. The arrest was anticlimactic compared to the dramatic manhunt that had preceded it. Aileen, drunk and belligerent, initially maintained her innocence but quickly began making contradictory statements. Ty, meanwhile, was released after questioning, though investigators were certain she possessed knowledge about the crimes. In custody, Aileen initially denied any involvement in the murders. She claimed never to have heard of the victims and insisted that the similarity between the composite sketches and her appearance was coincidental. However, as investigators presented more evidence, fingerprints found in victims' cars, witness identifications, and ballistics evidence linking the murders, her stories began to change. The breakthrough in the interrogation came when investigators played recordings of phone calls between Aileen and Ty. Unknown to Aileen, Ty had agreed to cooperate with law enforcement and had been instructed to call Aileen while she was in jail. During these recorded conversations, Ty encouraged Aileen to confess, saying it would be better for both of them if she told the truth. The psychological manipulation was subtle but effective. Ty, the one person Aileen trusted completely, was now working with the authorities. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound Aileen had ever received. On January 16, 1991, she broke down and confessed to 6 of the 7 murders. Her confessions were detailed and chilling. She described each encounter with clinical precision, explaining how she had lured the men to remote locations, how she had killed them, and what she had done with their belongings. However, she maintained that each killing had been in self-defense, claiming that all of her victims had either raped her, attempted to rape her, or threatened her life. The self-defense claims were met with skepticism by investigators. The physical evidence contradicted many of her assertions, and the pattern of theft suggested robbery as a primary motive. Moreover, her descriptions of the attacks varied significantly between tellings, with details changing or disappearing entirely. Aileen's case would eventually involve 6 separate murder trials, as each victim's death was prosecuted individually in the county where the body had been found. The first trial, for the murder of Richard Mallory, began in DeLand, Florida, in January 1992. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Aileen Wuornos was a serial killer who had murdered 7 men during the course of armed robberies. The evidence included ballistics reports linking the murder weapon to multiple crime scenes, fingerprint evidence placing her in the victim's vehicles, witness testimony identifying her at various locations, and her own recorded confessions. The defense strategy was more complex. Aileen's attorneys argued that she had indeed killed the men, but that each killing was justified self-defense. They painted a picture of a woman who had been abused her entire life and who had finally fought back against male violence. They emphasized her traumatic childhood, her history of sexual assault, and her claims that each victim had attacked or threatened her. The self-defense strategy faced significant challenges. Florida's self-defense laws required that the person claiming self-defense must have been in imminent danger and must have used only the force necessary to prevent harm. The evidence suggested that Aileen had used excessive force and had robbed her victims after killing them, actions inconsistent with legitimate self-defense. During the trial, disturbing details about Aileen's life emerged. Expert witnesses testified about the effects of childhood trauma, the psychology of prostitution, and the prevalence of violence against sex workers. However, the prosecution successfully argued that regardless of her background, murder was not justified. The first trial concluded with Aileen's conviction for first-degree murder in the death of Richard Mallory. The jury recommended death, and Judge Uriel Blunt sentenced her to die in Florida's electric chair. The verdict was hardly surprising given the evidence, but it marked the beginning of a legal process that would stretch on for more than a decade. Subsequent trials followed a similar pattern. Aileen would sometimes maintain her innocence, sometimes confess, and sometimes claim self-defense, often within the same hearing. Her behavior in court was erratic and increasingly bizarre. She would curse at judges, fire her attorneys, and make rambling statements that seemed designed to ensure her execution rather than prevent it. In the trial for David Spears' murder, she chose to plead no contest, essentially admitting guilt while not formally confessing. She received another death sentence. The pattern continued through the remaining trials: Charles Carskadden, Troy Burress, Dick Humphreys, and Walter Antonio. Each conviction brought another death sentence. The case of Peter Seams was never prosecuted, as his body was never found and the evidence was considered insufficient for a murder charge, despite the recovery of his vehicle and Aileen's apparent confession to his killing. Aileen's time on death row was marked by increasing mental instability and bizarre behavior. She alternated between maintaining her innocence and confessing to additional crimes she had not committed. She claimed to have killed dozens of other victims, descriptions that investigators determined were fabricated. Her relationship with the media became increasingly important to her. She gave numerous interviews to journalists, often contradicting her previous statements and adding new details to her story. Some of these interviews suggested genuine remorse for her actions, while others showed no empathy for her victims or their families. The appeals process moved slowly through the courts. Her attorneys argued that she had been mentally incompetent during her trials, that she had received inadequate legal representation, and that her confessions had been coerced. They also argued that her history of abuse and mental illness should have precluded the death penalty. However, Aileen increasingly worked against her own appeals. She publicly stated that she wanted to die and that she did not want her attorneys to continue fighting her death sentences. She claimed that she would kill again if released and that execution was the appropriate punishment for her crimes. By 2002, Aileen had exhausted most of her appeals and was scheduled for execution. Her final interviews revealed a woman who seemed to have given up on life entirely. She maintained that she had been treated unfairly by the criminal justice system while simultaneously acknowledging the brutality of her crimes. In her final statement, she said, "I killed those men, robbed them as cold as ice. And I'd do it again, too. There's no chance in keeping me alive or anything, because I'd kill again. I have hate crawling through my system." On October 9, 2002, at 9:47 a.m., Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at the Florida State Prison. She was 46 years old. Her final meal was a cup of coffee, and her last words were reported to be, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day, with Jesus June 6th. Like the movie, Big Mother Ship and all, I'll be back." The Aileen Wuornos case fundamentally changed how law enforcement, criminologists, and society viewed female violence and serial killing. Her crimes demonstrated that women were capable of the same cold-blooded violence traditionally associated with male perpetrators, while also highlighting the complex relationship between victimization and perpetration. Her story became the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and films, most notably the 2003 movie, Monster, starring Charlize Theron, who won an Academy Award for her portrayal of Aileen. These works struggled with the challenge of depicting a killer who was simultaneously a victim, a woman who had endured horrific abuse but who had also committed terrible crimes. The case also raised important questions about the treatment of sex workers, the effects of childhood trauma, and the adequacy of mental health services. Many observers noted that while Aileen's crimes were inexcusable, they were also the predictable result of a system that had failed her at every stage of her life. Aileen Wuornos died as she had lived, alone, angry, and unrepentant. Her story offers no easy answers about the nature of evil, the effects of trauma, or the possibility of redemption. She was simultaneously a victim and a victimizer, a woman who had been brutalized by life and who had chosen to brutalize others in return. Her crimes were not the result of a single moment of madness or a temporary lapse in judgment. They were the culmination of decades of abuse, neglect, and systemic failure. Every institution that should have protected her, family, school, social services, the criminal justice system, had instead failed her or actively harmed her. Yet this tragic background cannot excuse the cold-blooded murder of 7 men who were guilty of nothing more than seeking the services of a prostitute. Each of her victims left behind families, friends, and communities devastated by their loss. Their deaths were not justified by her suffering, nor were they the inevitable result of her traumatic past. The story of Aileen Wuornos serves as a dark mirror reflecting society's treatment of its most vulnerable members. It demonstrates how cycles of abuse and violence can perpetuate themselves across generations and how a failure to intervene early can have catastrophic consequences. It also shows how even the most damaged individuals retain agency and responsibility for their choices. In the end, Aileen Wuornos became exactly what she had always been told she was, a monster. But the true horror of her story lies not in the killings themselves, but in the recognition that monsters are not born, they are made. Her life stands as a testament to the human capacity for both evil and suffering, and to the terrible consequences when society fails its most vulnerable children. The highways of Florida no longer echo with her presence, but her story continues to haunt the American consciousness. She remains a reminder that justice must be tempered with compassion, that punishment must be balanced with understanding, and that the most dangerous predators are often those who were once prey themselves. Aileen Wuornos was America's first female serial killer, but more than that, she was a cautionary tale about what happens when society discards its most vulnerable members. Her legacy is written in blood on the dark highways of Florida, but it should also be written in the reforms and interventions that might prevent other damaged children from following her path into darkness.